Welcome to the Rethinking Porn Addiction podcast. Pornography and other out-of-control sexual behaviors can cause you and your loved ones immense pain, shame, and grief. It can be confusing and frustrating when you keep going back to behaviors that conflict with your values even after you've committed to yourself and to others that you'll stop. Here on this show, we believe that sexual health is the solution to those problems. Sexual health is more than just avoiding the things that will hurt you or your relationships. It's about cultivating a beautiful balance between safety and pleasure. For most men in our culture, you have to either hurt someone, be hurt by someone, or be diagnosed with a disease in order to have your first sexual health conversation. But here at Rethinking Porn Addiction, admission is free. Did it work? Guys, it worked.
That was awesome.
That was if you're watching live or watching later, we moved to a new platform, and I spent some time over the last week cobbling together a whole bunch of stock footage to put together an official introduction to our show, 20 episodes in. So it may not be perfect, but it's a start, and we're grateful that you're here with us today. My name is Nate Bagley. Up on our top row, as always, we've got Hans Hubrick and Jake Hodson, and down below us, we've got Kristen Hodson, and we've got Doug Braun-Harvey, who are our local clinicians. Kristen and Jake are also married, which is wonderful. And we're here to talk today about something that's really important. First of all, I think it's worth noting, if you're jumping in and this is your first episode with us, you're 20 episodes down the line. So we always recommend going back and starting from the beginning so you have context for all of these conversations. But today we're going to get into what I believe is part of the crux of the porn problem for so many people. And I think it can be a really painful experience for people to understand, how do you balance your faith, your religious beliefs, and your desire to experience pleasure. And so that's kind of what we're gonna explore today. Jake and Hans, do you guys want to share a little bit about your experience kind of learning to, was it ever hard for you to balance those two things, your religious beliefs or your faith and your desire for pleasure?
I think it still can be. Like I mean, it's still a balance. And I actually had a friend suggested a cool word that I might like even more than balance. It's a blend. Balance somehow infers like a win-loss situation. It's a net zero game, but a blend can be different than that. So anyway, yeah, it is still, for me, it's still an interesting blend to think through about what my pleasure tells me and what I experience there versus what I experience in the religious belief system that I also hold dear. And that is dictated a lot more. Yeah, go ahead, Nate. Sorry.
What's the conflict?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. So the conflict is the religious belief system that I have is tied to a certain religion, and that religion has a set of standards. Whether it's a moral set of standards or a cultural set of standards or a blend of those, there's a set of standards that can conflict with, or at times has conflicted with, the pleasure that I've experienced in my life as a result of my sexual being.
Do the standards mention pleasure?
No, Doug. And I think we've talked about that on previous shows, that so for myself, the standard was essentially you do not get to experience sexual pleasure until you're married, and then usually only within the bounds of having children. Which was a very small, constrained experience within which you were allowed to experience pleasure. And outside of that, it was, and this is all my own interpretation, outside of that, it was self-indulgent, and it was allowing yourself to give into your carnal nature, and it was allowing yourself to be less than you could be. Those are all kind of the labels that I felt or that I recall from when I struggled with the balance of pleasure and faith.
Jake, what about you?
Yeah, I remember conversations we've had offline when we first started talking with Doug. And I remember talking to both Hansen and Nate and having a question where I asked afterwards of, did you guys ever hear pleasure mentioned with sex growing up in terms of the religious elements of it? And the answer was no. And it was never a thing. Sanctity was one, like all these other words, and they were all sort of real heavy words, but the actual like pleasure with sex was never, for me at least, was never part and parcel with the package.
Yeah, I remember conversations revolving around like they would say all the warning things and use all the fancy language like sex is sacred, sex is between a husband and a wife. I got that a lot. Sex is like a really special experience that reserved for one person. And then if pleasure was ever mentioned, it was always in as like an addendum at the very end. And it feels really great, but like or like it can be a lot of fun, but that's not why we do it. We do it so we can have families, and we do it so we can like it almost felt the way that I heard people talk about it, it almost sounded like how do I put this? I'm a firm believer that sex can be a religious experience. But the religious experience I'm talking about is not like sitting in church. There's a big difference between sitting in church religious experience and experiencing an orgasm with your partner religious experience. And whenever they refer to it as like sex is sacred, or it's like you and your partner working together with God to create life, like it always seemed it was kind of like the church type of sacredness and not the like ecstasy, eyes rolling in the back of the head, like right on the fringes of reality kind of sacred.
I just want to point out, notice how much great words you have
Yeah.
for all of the words you were given. And then when you try to talk about this experience with words you weren't given, it's tough.
Yeah.
It is tough, but Nate, I was personally gonna say I like the emotion and the descriptiveness that you put behind it. And that is really an interesting blend for me to talk about. That being religion is also separate from spirituality and spiritual experience. That was important for me to define for myself at some point in my own religious belief making. So yes, I would totally agree that sex and sexual pleasure is and can be a very spiritually fulfilling, meaningful experience. And I would also agree that that was not ever talked about with regard to the religious upbringing that I had, or the familial upbringing that I had. So my family of origin, we're all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it was a uniform experience, I think, for myself and all of my siblings. So it's not just religion, and I think we mentioned that when we were talking about this show. We're talking today specifically about the conflict between religion and sexual pleasure, but I think there are many other conflicts that fit into this same type of discussion that are also interesting to consider as we're talking about it.
Definitely.
Whether that's societal standards or expectations from your partner, or a whole bunch of other conflicts that could feel similar to religious versus sexual pleasure.
So I think uniformly across all three of our experiences, and I'm maybe Kristen and Doug, you've had experiences like this too, but you kind of come to an impasse. You reach a gridlock where I think all of us experience this as I think it's fairly universal. If you have some sort of religious upbringing, conservative religious upbringing, you're going to come into conflict when it comes to pleasure and your identity or your sexual health plan, as we've referred to it, and your relationship with church. Maybe not necessarily your relationship with God, but sometimes if your relationship with God is directly attached to your relationship with church, that can get really complicated as well. And so I feel like there's times where it's like, okay, I want to experience more pleasure, I want to experience more connection, but I need to, like, it needs to fall in line with what I believe religiously. And if those two things don't fall in line, I have a conflict. I have a values conflict. I have a gridlock, and the gridlock could be gridlock within my relationship, or it could be just a gridlock within myself, my own internal values, where it's like, okay, which of the two things do I sacrifice? Do I sacrifice? Do I compromise my religious standards and go, explore the pleasure side of my life, or do I just subdue and push down the pleasure side so that I can remain in alignment with my kind of religious standards? And I think that's kind of the big conflict that at least I experience, and that I hear a lot of other people experiencing. And I think what I'd like to really address is, what do you do when you're in that point of gridlock? Like, how, without sacrificing who you are and without sacrificing the things that are important to you, how do you create space for both to coexist?
I want to just back up at one thing, Nate, first, because I really love the question, what do you do? But before we get to this, the actions, who do you have this conversation with? Is this a bowling alone exercise?
I have it with you right now, Doug.
But I mean that seriously, because I hear this often. The movement is quickly to the solution, whereas you're in this alone kind of place, in this sort of dilemma or conflict. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, where would you speak it aloud? Who would you bring this, kind of real, conflict to, or is it something you have to kind of deal with on your own? I'd want to start there before, what the actual, kind of parameters of how we move forward are.
Well,
And
ahead,
piggybacking on what Doug said, is I'm curious. I think that's a really good question. And if many of you had conversations with your parents, or if your first conversations about sexual health were with your ecclesiastical leader, and that is where you were initially trying to have a conversation, or did have the conversation in it, and then that formed or shaped. Like, I'm just curious for all of you. I'm seeing you. Yeah, Jake.
I think the difference is we're coming at this like it's a two-way road. It was never a two-way road. For me, it was never a two-way road. I was spoken to about sexuality, sexual health, the principles, and they were given to me as revealed by God. So there was no room for give and take. There was no room for dialogue. There was no room for curiosity or wondering or anything. It was, this is the law. Obedience to the law nets this result. Disobedience to the law yields these results. Period. Come and see me when you mess up.
Yeah, I want to echo that, and something like you said it, you put it perfectly, Kristen. And I think the thing that popped into my head when you were asking those questions, Doug and Kristen, is every time I had a conversation about this this kind of crucible, this conflict, the people that I spoke to, or the people that I could speak to, always had a bias towards faith first and pleasure as something that was secondary. I would say that Kristen and Doug, like these conversations with you, or like since I met Kristen and started developing friends in more of the therapy world, that was the first time that I ever actually started having meaningful conversations that even invited the possibility that your pleasure could be important. And
what was that like for you to hear? Can you take us back there? What's
jarring.
it like to be jarring? Why? What was jarring for you about it?
For somebody to, it was like the first time that somebody had even made a case for pleasure. These conversations are some of the first conversations that I've had where somebody made a case that what brings you pleasure carries significance and weight, and it's important, and it's worth exploring, and it's worth understanding, and it's part of who you are and part of your identity, and it's worthy. You know, there's a sense of meaning involved in it, and there's opportunity to connect with the person that you love when you start to have these conversations. And like I never knew there was so much behind the pleasure that for the first 3 decades of my life, give or take, I was basically either told to shut down, told that it was bad, told that it was evil, told that I had to turn it off, or told that it was dangerous. You know, there's all these narratives that I had about my pleasure that I basically felt like I still feel like now in my marriage I'm still suffering fallout from that narrative,
Yeah.
because there's a part of me that's scared of my capacity for pleasure, or that feels like it's selfish, or I feel like it's entitled, or and you could go even darker than that and say it's like evil, the natural man, that it's carnal, lustful, you know, all of these things that oftentimes get associated with evil and bad and unworthy.
Did you hear how you changed your voice when you went through that list? Could you hear it? It's not just words. It's like it lives in your body.
Yeah.
You could hear the like. It became. You could hear the
The
kind of
thespian in me is
disdain
coming
just when
out.
you went through the list. Yes, but I mean, that's I only wanted to say that because that's how powerful these messages are. You didn't just. It wasn't a grocery list recited to us. It was. You know. It was. I could feel the visceralness of it
Yeah.
when you went through those words.
So Doug, to answer your question, the answer is yes, I did have people to talk to, but the only conversation was about spirituality, your relationship with God, your whether or not you're keeping the rules, and there wasn't much of a conversation beyond that for me.
Yeah. Others.
I was the same until way late in life. Maybe 35 years into my life before I really started having some meaningful conversation that helped me to start defining it on my own outside of the religious framework that I had grown up with. And I think, Nate, you asked earlier about that conflict point. For me, I did do a lot of that soul searching on my own. So I was similar, I think, to what Jake described, and Nate, you've echoed about hearing from ecclesiastical leaders or others that it was a prescribed manner of sexual existence. And there was not a two-way exchange until much later in life. And when that first started happening, it was really, I think, on my own, trying to figure out what the hell's going on here. Like, how is there such a great divide and conflict between what I experience and what I am taught or have been taught? And then since, the past 5-10 years, and I've said it on the show before, I have just been incredibly fortunate to find talking partners and people that are vulnerable and safe enough that I can have these kind of open conversations with.
What has made a safe and vulnerable space for you? Like, what are the elements of that?
One of them that comes to mind really quickly is having friends. And this is another aspect, I think, of the religious upbringing that we came out of. Having friends that were actually willing to be vulnerable and admit the same challenges or struggles or points of conflict in their own life. I've had some really vulnerable conversations with friends, and a couple of them have come out of kind of the addiction-based treatment model of telling other people about it. But I have had, that's been one of them, Kristen, is other people being willing myself to admit where I'm at and to talk about it openly, and then having other people around me that have been willing to show that vulnerable side themselves also, because they've been through exactly the same thing that I have, that a large majority of all LDS or otherwise conservative religious men have been through, and women also. We're
Hans,
talking
did you
men
ever
here.
consider your pleasure an addiction? Because it sounds like you've spoken to men who sort of used that idea, or that sort of, they were maybe in addiction recovery programs related to sexuality. Was that a part of your understanding of yourself, or that was just something you heard other men speak of?
Yes, at times, because that's the context that I grew up in. There were certain points where I was like, yeah, I'm an addict also. I just haven't been into a addiction program or haven't sought therapy of that model yet. But I recognized or put that label on myself of, yes, I'm a sexual addict or an addict, a porn addict. So yeah, that was certainly part of my own personal journey of figuring out, sorting through my own experiences. Yeah.
Was your pleasure part of your addiction? I mean, did you sort of think of this pleasure as the addiction, or how did you think of it? Because I mean, I'm just sort of curious about that thread.
No, it was, for me, thinking back now, the pleasure aspect, the masturbation orgasm was distinct for the most part from the use of pornography or sexual imagery, which is the main route that I use for solo sex or my own solo sexual pleasure. And it was not, that's an interesting question, Doug, now that I'm thinking about it, because although we didn't talk about pleasure growing up and in the belief system, my belief framework, we didn't talk about pleasure. Pornography was talked about a lot, and pornography or sexual imagery was always in a negative light, and pleasure was just absent from the conversation, I would say. Like, there wasn't an acknowledgement of, you like viewing sexual imagery and masturbation or solo sex because it feels amazing, because it brings you sexual pleasure, which is incredible. So the use of pornography was very much had the stigma of an addiction or out of control behavior. Pleasure itself was not, for me at least anyways, was not viewed or labeled or put into that same addictive language or concept or framework.
Thank you.
So
Does that distinction make sense? And I'm curious if, yeah, sorry.
No, as I'm just listening to you talk, it sounds like there wasn't, as I'm just kind of listening to you all there, you were first just kind of talked to, and then when you did start to have these conversations, and pleasure wasn't present, like that wasn't named, there wasn't a dot connected for you to be like, you enjoy this because it feels really good. Right. But then it sounds like your first entry into having these conversations or to start trying to find safe space was born out of confessing to each other or coming clean or sharing, and then you were able to get vulnerable. Is that how they began? To find your way into safe spaces?
Yeah, with my friends. So with the other men that I've talked to, or friends I've talked about it with on this topic, it was kind of in that confession mode. With Cammie, my partner, it was through her discovery of my use of sexual imagery and porn. So that was a different, and the intro, Nate, awesome intro that you put together talks about the entry points for men and discussions about sexual health, and that price of admission usually is some traumatic experience, which was the discovery that Cammie had. So that's where my conversation with her started. My meaningful conversations, I should say, and but with other men, it's been kind of in that confession style discourse or exchange.
We're all sexual failures, and now that we know we're not alone, we can commiserate over it. That's kind of the vibe, right?
Yeah.
We've all hurt people. We've all screwed up. We're all guilty of the same crime here. And so now we don't have to pretend anymore. We can just be who we are. And there's a sense of relief in that. But there's also a new kind of burden that gets placed on your shoulders of like, well, now I've admitted it, so it must be true. And so you kind of have to just deal with things going from there. And that can be, I mean, that can feel safe because you can finally feel like you have 2 feet on the ground. But I think there's also an innate sadness and this idea that like, yeah, I have to admit that I am this person now.
Yeah.
Like, in order to have the conversation. So,
Jake's back. Jake, I'm curious if you have any thoughts you'd like to add to this before we kind of talk about the religion interface with the pleasure.
Yeah, I've been having some network issues, so I've been going in and out. The one thing I kind of heard last before I was jumping out was Hans sort of explaining how he kind of had to find his peer group before he was able to get to a place that was vulnerable. And I think I was very much the same way. You know, you feel so isolated again when it's presented to you as sort of right or wrong, black and white, law versus breaking the law. There's that shame that we've talked about. And we've talked about it a lot, so I don't want to revisit that. But I think it's important to understand that as you go into it, because I think it's important to understand that there are natural sort of blocks for opening up and being vulnerable, and to understand that. To understand that it's going to feel lonely or isolating, and like that you're the only one who might be dealing with this, or a lot of confusion around the topic. And then when you meet one person or 2 people that, you know, same thing happened with me, then suddenly you feel more camaraderie and less like you're the outlier, you know, that suddenly the scatter chart is a lot more consolidated and you're more in the middle than you probably thought before. And I think there's great power in that. There's great power in community. And I think for those of us that were raised this way and taught these parameters and then had the dissonance build up between religious values and pleasure, it takes that community to sort of come out and to understand that, you know, this is okay, or I'm okay, or to at least reevaluate your position in the faith pleasure dynamic.
I definitely think community is huge here, but I think there's a dark side to community also, where on the one hand you can feel a sense of relief. I'm not the only one. I found people who are like me. But on the other side, I think if you're a part of the wrong community, or the community has a set of standards and beliefs that are disempowering, you know, you can come into that community. Like Jake, you've mentioned multiple times, like going to a treatment center and sitting in the room and being like, am I like these guys? Because the things that they're talking about dealing with are not the things that I'm dealing with. So do I really belong here? And I think there's I kind of, it scares me to even think about just knowing you, what would have happened to you if you would have been like, yeah, I am one of these guys. This is who I am.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing about community, though, right? Is like there's a lot of different communities, but when you find your community, and I did go to these treatment. I went to a treatment program and sat in the meetings and was, you know, I am not here. Should I be here? Maybe yes, maybe no. But I never felt a sense of belonging or what am I trying to say? It didn't feel right. Like from the jump, it just didn't feel right. It felt like there was a very defined and specific outcome, and there was a way to get to that outcome. And I remember talking about my family history a little bit, and the guy that was kind of leading the session grabbed onto sort of 3 little nuggets that I said about myself, and then that sort of defined me and was the causation for why this and this and this occurred. And I remember writing in my little journal thing that I had at the time and going, I don't necessarily think that. But again, I'm also looking at my wife and going, I do want to stay married, and this is so. But then when I started to talk to people like Hans or just some of these other friends and realize, I'm not alone, that's when I found my real community, right? That's when I found the people where it went, okay, wait a second. There's a scale here. It's not either or, and it's not black and white. And everything up to that point was very binary. And that was very, very hard for me to deal with. And then when I started to understand that there was more of a scale and that, a person could enjoy these things, look at sexual imagery or practice solo sex, and it didn't mean they were a monster or the other things that I sort of heard or painted myself into, and it became very liberating and freeing to a certain extent.
Jay, can you talk about that same consequence from what did it mean to you from your religion or faith perspective that because you talked about I'm not a monster and things like that. I don't know if that came from a faith narrative or there's another faith narrative that you had to kind of deal with, when you kind of realized, this was part of you and you had to kind of grapple with what you were told it meant in possibly your religion.
Yeah, and my religiosity, if that's a word, is very messy. It's very messy, and it's always been very messy. And my personality and the type of person I am, I've always struggled with rigidity. I've always struggled with that. So with the sexual rigidity with which I was born into, it was sort of it was always a battle and always a struggle, and I wanted so desperately for things to work out, but I always felt like I was butting my head against it. And then it wasn't until I started to let go of some of the things that really sort of sent me down these shame cycles that I felt that freedom, and honestly was probably able to experience pleasure in a different sort of way, because I had kind of hangover baggage after we got married, and I was still, doing things according to the law or the word or whatever. I still felt I didn't feel fully comfortable. Again, pleasure was introduced very later on. And so I still was worried about checking the boxes and making sure everything was okay and not trying to have a pleasurable experience. And it wasn't until I transitioned and let go that it was sort of like, okay, wait, a person can be both and. And I remember Chrissy teaching me that concept of both and instead of either or. And it was probably in a different facet of our life, but it carried over into this. And it was so liberating for me.
I think that's what came up for me, Nate, when I was hearing you describe either you have pleasure and kind of start to explore your sexual self, or you have these values and religious beliefs, as if each of these are these one thing. But when you say values plural and religious beliefs plural, there's so much in there, and sexual pleasures, there's so much in there. And I think when we're trying to say, can you have your sexuality and your faith, when we're trying to merge these two giant bodies as if they're just this or this, when you break down your religious beliefs, there's a lot of room to start to understand and where it can overlap with your sexuality. And it's very possible to make both and. But I think we have to look at it not as just these giant, I'm at a loss of how to describe it, but it just felt these big bodies of.
Well, I described it that way on purpose, and that's because that's how people describe it to me. Like,
yes,
our listeners,
yes,
that's how they feel right now, is I'm trapped.
Yes.
I feel like if I'm going to be a good Christian man or a good Christian woman, then I can't do this and I can't do this and I shouldn't do that and I shouldn't do this and I shouldn't ask questions about this and I shouldn't put pressure on my spouse to do this. And like, that's what defines my goodness. And on the other side, they're like, there's this whole, I have all these desires and fantasies and curiosities and ways that I'd like to connect with my partner and sexual acts that I'd like to try or things that I'd like to explore, but I feel like they're all off limits because if I explore them, then I have to compromise that identity of being a good believing Christian or a good faithful husband or a faithful wife, you know? And so there is a sense of like, there's a, how do I put this? I'm using defining words like good and bad right now. And I think there comes a point where you have to realize like who's deciding what's good and what's bad. And does your pastor get to decide? Does your bishop get to decide? Does your priest get to decide? Do the scriptures get to decide? Do you get to decide? And that's, maybe I'd like to throw this back at Doug and Kristen, the professionals who've worked with people going through these kind of conflict gridlock moments. What are the things that help people expand the view from either or to both and? How do you get past those?
There's a couple of words I'm going to offer to the conversation because I haven't heard them spoken yet. When these conversations come up, people tend to tell stories that are about the consequences rather than what's happening between you and who you have the conflict. If it's a church or a figure or somebody else. And I'd invite you to think about it. What I'm really hearing spoken about, how do I talk about this, this part of my life and deal with the judgments that will be told to me? How do I talk about this part of my life and deal with the opinions that I will be given by others? How do I talk about this part of my life and face the potential rejection that I may face from certain people? I think that's a different idea than I can't or I can. Because I think the can't or I can is a choice people make after they've endured the judgment, after they've endured the potential risk of rejection, after they've heard the opinions, or they've imagined them. They haven't even, they just imagine them is enough. But so, I mean, I'm inviting those three ideas to be part of the conversation: how we deal with judgments, opinions, and the risk of rejection.
And I would add to that of what do you need to share? Like to move it from a place of, I think, Doug, people of faith can go in and feel like they need to confess all instead of breaking it down even further to be like, what do I get to keep is just mine? And what do I want to share, and to start shifting out of this idea, like to move to a place of sharing versus confession. Yeah. Because initially that confession lens is really big, and it can feel like that is the way to talk about sexuality instead of what do I want to share? And is this the person that I should be sharing with so I can have a dialogue? Or from their context, will there not really be an opportunity for a dialogue because of the role they're playing? And so maybe I need to find another place if I want to dialogue and share and be seen. Does that?
Dialogue is very different than rejection, judgment, and opinion.
Very different. And one, it's very different, but I don't think that we can expect that everybody can or should. Are you laughing at the cat, Jake? I'm seeing you smile.
We're all laughing at the cat.
I know. But I don't think
your cat wants pleasure. That's all there is to it.
She does. She wants to sit on the heater on my lap. But I think that's one of the other things is to start to give ourselves permission, or for men to give themselves permission that they can be entitled to some privacy or boundaries, and some part, like what parts of their sexuality can be theirs. And go ahead.
That to me is the crux. And I've underlined it on my paper here, is you have to own your own sexuality. at some point in time, if you really want to do this, if you really want to make progress, for me, I was spinning in a loop, constantly butting my head up when I was looking on the outside in, when I was waiting to be told what to do, when I was being directed in how I should act. That's when I was constantly making no progress and spinning my wheels. When I finally understood that I would have to own my own sexuality, make my decisions, and have the consequences wherever they may be, that's when I was able to make sort of progression in this. And I think that is absolutely key for anyone out there. If they were to come to me and say, when was the turning point? It was then. When I looked at it and I said, this is my sexuality.
So it sounds like you made a shift from external authority to internal authority.
Yes.
You're looking for somebody else to tell you what to do versus you're saying, this is what's best for me right now.
And it was very difficult and it was very uncomfortable and all the varies that go along with it. And it took a long time. It didn't happen overnight. But that is, if I can go back and look and talk to Jake of 10 years ago, it would be like, hey, buddy, you've got to own your sexuality. And I probably been, well, what about this? And what about my church? And what about my bishop? And what about this? And it would have been like, great for all those things. But until you take control of this, you will be controlled by it. And if others are controlling that, that means they're controlling you.
Wow.
A sentence that just came out of my head, Jake, listening to you. I'm going to just change some words around. Until you take responsibility for your vision of sexual health, somebody else will want to be responsible for your vision of sexual health.
Mm-hmm.
That's well said, Doug and Nate.
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I was going to say, I said Nate, I meant Jake. I was going to ask a question to try to get at what you just shared, and I love that you did. And that was just to hear more about that moment. What I heard you say, and I'm going to say it back to see if it's accurate, is you, for a long time, you were told what type of sexual being you were supposed to be, or what type of being you were supposed to be, and sexual pleasure was or was not some component of that. But there was some other external authority or external picture or expectation that was telling you what that was supposed to look like. And the important turning point that you're talking about is when you got to a point where you were willing to put that to the side and look at your own self and say, this is my sexual being. This is who I am as a sexual being. And then start to navigate from that place forward, as opposed to trying to accept what someone else or others were telling you were supposed to be. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's
correct?
exactly it. And for those of you that know me, it's not like this is a far stretch, right? Because this is who I am. I've always been this sort of guy that hates to be molded into these things, but with this aspect of my life in particular, I hung on way long into trying to fit this mold. And it was constantly frustrating and numbing and distancing and isolating and all the things that come along that we've spoken about in the 20 episodes before. And it didn't crack. It didn't start to change at all until I took ownership. And it was really scary to take ownership, and it was so empowering.
So can I ask a follow-up question to all three of you?
Yeah.
Because I'm hearing the taking ownership of your sexual self. What about, taking ownership of your spiritual and religious self? Because I think there's been a pivot there, and that's possibly another avenue as to how you made them both work, is your vision for your spiritual self has shifted a bit from, I am privileged to know all of you personally, but there's been also some reconciliation of claiming a bit more of who you are as a spiritual being.
Yeah.
And your does that make sense? To me, it's the other side of the coin we're talking about. And we can claim our sexual self, but still be in a very externally loaded religious self. And it seems like if you're going to marry the two of these, at some point you have to take responsibility for both of those and create your vision for both.
Changing one will inherently change the other. So
Okay.
this is what I'm
Yeah.
realizing is that you can't, if you grew up in a religious society, you can't change your relationship with your own personal sexuality without changing your relationship with your faith, with religion, or with God, or whatever that looks like. It's almost like your sexuality is a catalyst into a new stage of faith. So if you guys have ever studied Fowler's Stages of Faith, super fascinating. But he talks about kind of the evolution of faith, um, and how like a child believes differently than an adolescent, and an adolescent believes like as your brain's ability to kind of understand the abstract and your concept of God can change. Like a kid may not be able to differentiate between a literal and symbolic story. They may be able to repeat the story and understand the underlying meanings, but they still can't tell the difference between what's literal and what's figurative, what's the lesson, what's symbolic. And as your faith advances, it becomes more personal and more unique and less like scripted and kind of cookie cutter and template. And the template exists for certain people at a certain stage because they need the structure, they need the definitions, they need the lines to tell them where to draw, because it provides like a framework and a sense of comfort, and it helps them believe at the stage that they're at. But I think, speaking personally, when I started to really take ownership and responsibility for my sexuality, it put pressure on me to really re-examine who I was as a man of faith. And I've had to like recreate my relationship with God. I have had to redefine the purpose and role that religion plays in my life. I've had to like have conversations with myself about uh, who who gets to make choices and decisions, and who holds authority in my life in certain areas of my life, and do I get to make these decisions on my own? And exactly what Doug was saying, am I willing? What consequences am I willing to, both social and familial and faith consequences, am I willing to take on in order to have more independence with my relationship with God? There's always going to be a consequence on the other side. And so I think you're absolutely right. What Jake is talking about, taking responsibility for your sexuality, cannot happen unless you're simultaneously taking responsibility for your faith beliefs. Because if you're determined to keep your faith beliefs the same, there's no space for you to own your sexuality. That
Nate, we're all jumping in. Nate, that's awesome. I really appreciate sharing that, and I'm really interested to hear you talk more about your feeling now, your personal wellness, your personal ownership of your own faith, now that you've been through that process. Can I ask? That's a personal question, but I'd love to hear you just talk about that.
It's it's dangerous. That's how I feel right now. Is when you're coloring inside the lines and obeying the rules that other people have given you, there's a sense of safety. There's like a second opinion, always saying like you're making the right choice. There's, friends and family members who are patting you on the back saying you're doing what's right. And there's a sense of comfort in like doing everything the way that you're told to do it. It feels really nice. And then as I've kind of grown and evolved a little bit and decided like, I mean, if we want to, we got a lot more religious in last week's conversation. If I could bring it full circle, uh, if you're Christian and you read the New Testament, the story of Jesus, the people that Jesus despised the most were the people who were obsessed with following the rules to the letter of the law. Like they thought that your salvation was bought by your obedience to little rules. And those were the people that he like argued with and denounced and fought with and kind of despised and said, beware, don't be like these people. And I'm realizing that like there's a place for rules for people, but for me personally, I've had to kind of embrace the discomfort of being able to sit in a space where I can't make everybody else happy with my choices, that maybe not everybody's going to agree with my choices, and that my choices are, I consult my personal values first and then the religious structure second or third or fourth. You know, I talk to my partner about what's best for us and our family first, and we try and figure out what that looks like, and then we go to the next phase. And it bothers people. I know there's going to be people who are watching who are like, I don't know, Nate, you might be putting your salvation on the line, or you might be putting things at risk, or you might be disappointing God. Like there's a lot of things. There's a lot of people that we could make upset by living our lives that way. But that is the cost of living a life of integrity, sexual integrity at the very least, probably more integrity beyond that. But in order for me to have some sort of sexual integrity and to like feel comfortable exploring pleasure among many other things in my life, I've had to become the steward of my own salvation and my own religious beliefs, and not necessarily rely solely on the institutional guidelines. Does that make sense, Hans? Did that answer your question?
It was beautiful. Thanks for being vulnerable and sharing that.
So there's a huge element of discomfort to it.
Yeah.
It's deeply uncomfortable. I struggle with it. I will tell you right now, like I might even get emotional about it. It's really hard. Like every time I go visit my parents, I worry that I'm going to be disappointing them and letting them down. And I love my parents, and I'm not on this earth to please my parents, but I also I love them and I respect them, and I don't want them to be sad because of my choices. And so there's an element of like learning to differentiate and let them own their emotions and figure out their own journey. But it's deeply uncomfortable to be able to do that. It's deeply uncomfortable to have conversations with friends about how my religious beliefs might be shifting, and I may not align with them on everything like I used to, because I don't just follow the cookie cutter template on everything. And that has caused rifts in friendships, and it's caused people to be disappointed or confused or hurt. And it plays out in waves. Like it's like a constant thing it's like you're in the water, and the water is turbulent, and there's nothing you can do except try and learn to swim with the currents. But it can be suffocating at times when a wave hits you the wrong way, and it's just like, man, is it worth it? It can be really scary. But then Jake will probably say, when you catch a wave, it makes it worth it. Like, it's better to be in the water surfing and catching the occasional wave than just treading water and getting, I don't know. The analogies.
Never having the pleasure of the wave.
I was going to say, sitting on the shore.
The trade-off is, sitting on the shore. Jake goes out in the water, and he's going to try to get some pleasure of the wave. And there's trade-offs. Right. And so what I'm really hearing is, this is the complications in a religious, faith-based, part of one's life, when pleasure moves into a more prominent value and importance in how they live their life. This is the territory.
Yep.
And what I'm hearing is it requires a kind of flexible curiosity about what if these things weren't so rigid. Right. What if some things flexed a bit, or had some malleability? What would that be like? And that's what I'm hearing seems to be the inseparable part of this.
Right. Or what if church didn't have jurisdiction over every facet of my life? Like, what if my church didn't tell me what I was supposed to do financially, what I was supposed to do sexually, what I was supposed to do as a father, what qualifies me as a good father, what if church was just like about helping me cultivate a great relationship with God, and all of the other stuff that church tells me to do is just bonus material for people who need it, but I can take responsibility for that stuff myself. And
now, what's that like to say out loud? I have a feeling that was not a sentence you had when you were 20.
No, it's something that I've thought about a lot lately, and it's deeply uncomfortable, because that's not the perspective that many of my loved ones share. But like I said earlier, like this is the cost of being a fully integrated human. So I don't know. What was that?
I was going to say, to use a religious word, amen.
Well, give more words to that, Hans. Flesh that out for us. What made you? Because that's a feeling you're having. That's a way of expressing it. So what was it that you heard Nate say that needed the amen?
Yeah, thanks. I was smiling and I saw Jake smiling. I don't know why Jake was smiling. I'd like to hear. I was smiling because as I heard Nate talk, I got excitement about hearing a fellow traveler in life in those really sacred places of figuring out your own shit. And doing that in a way that is independent and scary and confusing. I just smiled because I loved hearing you express that, Nate, and I've felt that a lot in my own life and the growth that's come out of that. As you were talking, I kept hearing myself just say, man, that's an awesome space of growth for Nate. Like he's in that space and now he can grow. That's what I guess I have felt about myself. I have felt an immense amount of growth when I got to the point where I took my own, the word salvation comes from our church upbringing, but I took my own well-being and my own salvation and my own spiritual being. I took responsibility for that and I separated it from church. The word that you used a lot, Nate, was church. I fortunately have very much been able to hang on to many of the things of my religious upbringing and my belief framework from a young age that are very dear to me. And I have taken my own personal responsibility about figuring out how those fit into my life, as opposed to just going to church and hearing how the church says it's all supposed to fit together. And that's been it's been one of, if not the most rewarding experiences and developments in my life.
Love it.
Jake, you were smiling and scratching your head, dude, and I want to know what was going through your through your being at that point.
I want to be time sensitive, but I think about the coloring book analogy that you used, and there are people that there's these incredible books now with all the little things, and you can color in, and you have these incredible patterns, and it's beautiful and it's art. And there's a lot of people that's what they need, and that's what's working for them, and that's great. And then there are other people that are going to be handed a blank sheet of paper, and it's scary and intimidating and messy and all of the things, and it's a different type of art. And I have come to recognize, for me, I want a blank sheet of paper.
You're a Jackson Pollock kind of guy.
And I want to make mistakes. I want to not have lines to go over, and I want to be able to crumple it up and start again. And that's just who I am. And when you can see people who start to take ownership of this, there's growth. It's scary and it's hard. And to me, you really can't truly grow unless you have something hard and something that's, a little bit of fearful for you to overcome. And then you get this courage and this thing and this new perspective. And so I echo what Hans said of like watching Nate, you smile because you see people that go through the frustrating sort of head scratching or the doubt time of like, what am I doing? What am I doing? I'm leaving the path where I've been led along for so long. And then you start to lead your own path. And it's really incredible when you start to make your own decisions. And that's all there is to it for me. It's a place of being led along, following in the footsteps, or of taking ownership and now leading your life, whether it be spiritually or sexually or whatever it is. And it's incredible.
And I'll just wrap this up. I think it's worth end capping with this is that as I've gone through this process, it has actually deepened my meaning and deepened the significance of my relationship with God and redefined it even. Yeah. Like it's made. I think if more people could go through the uncomfortable process of going through this, they would find that talking about religious stuff and spiritual stuff isn't boring anymore. It's not scripted anymore. There's actual like really deep meaningful, profound conversations, the conversations that we crave when we go to church. Those are the conversations we get to have, like here on this show. These are the conversations that I used to crave when I was going to church. And I feel like we've recreated church for ourselves in some semblance. We're basically creating in these conversations what we wish we could have had when we were doing, I'm speaking for myself here, but I'm seeing smiles when we were doing church. And so I think it brings a new joy into your life. Like there's new anxiety, there's stress, it's scary, but also there's a deep amount of fulfillment and joy and connection on the other side. So I love the way this conversation went, that we expanded beyond the either or conversation and kind of demonstrated what it could look like for people to hold on to their faith and pleasure at the same time. Does anybody want to end with anything else? I know Hans has got to get out of here, so.
Just another amen, man.
Great. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you again soon.